The sun hung high in the clear blue sky, casting a warm glow over the small suburban town. The quiet streets were mostly peaceful, with the occasional car passing by. Mrs. Evelyn Jenkins, an elderly black woman in her 70s, had just finished her weekly trip to the local grocery store. She'd filled her canvas bags with fresh vegetables, canned goods, and a loaf of bread for the week. With her shopping bags gently resting in her arms, she made her way down the familiar sidewalk toward her home. Evelyn had lived in this town for decades. She'd raised her children here and had seen it grow over the years. The people who lived in her neighborhood were mostly kind, but there were still some old attitudes lingering. The town wasn't completely free of racial tension, though Evelyn never let it affect her too much. She had her routine, and she didn't let anything get in the way of it. Today, however, would be different. As Evelyn walked down the street, she was startled when a car pulled up next to her, its tires grinding over the pavement. The vehicle stopped, and out stepped Officer John Davis, a middle-aged man in his late 30s. He was a local cop, known for his brash behavior and unyielding attitude toward people of color. Evelyn had seen him before in the town's neighborhood, but never in such a close encounter. She didn't know him personally, but she knew enough from the town gossip to keep her distance. "Ma'am, hold up." Officer Davis called out to her, his voice stern and commanding. Evelyn paused in her tracks, unsure of what was happening. "Is there something wrong, officer?" she asked, trying to remain calm. Officer Davis took a few steps closer, his eyes scanning her up and down. The atmosphere was tense as Marcus helped his mother into the car. Evelyn, though physically exhausted and bruised, managed to offer him a reassuring smile. Her hands were still sore from the rough ropes, and her knees were scraped from the gravel, but she wasn't ready to show her pain. She wanted to protect Marcus, to tell him it was over, but she knew deep down that it wasn't. The fight was just beginning. Marcus could barely contain his anger. The scene he had witnessed was burned into his mind. The officer had treated his mother like a criminal, and worse, the officer had made it seem like she was the one at fault. He kept replaying the moment when Davis had tied her up, dragging her across the street with no regard for her age, her dignity, or her rights. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. The trial was fast approaching, and the tension in the small town was palpable. The days following the trial were filled with a tense, uneasy calm. The verdict was still on everyone's mind, but there was little anyone could do but wait. For Marcus and his mother, Evelyn, it felt as if the whole world was holding its breath. The courthouse had emptied, but the weight of the trial lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved. Marcus couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the images of that terrible day again: his mother, tied up, dragged across the street, humiliated, and hurting. He had replayed it all in his head so many times that he could almost feel the heat of the sun on his face and hear his mother's cries for help. And, just as often, he saw the coldness in Officer Davis's eyes, the way he had treated Evelyn as if she were nothing more than an object. It had been more than a public injustice, it had been personal. Evelyn, on the other hand, remained calm outwardly, though she, too, felt the pressure. She was tired, yes, but in her heart, she knew that the fight was far from over. The trial had been one step, but the road to true justice, one that would make her feel whole again, was still far from clear. She had to be strong, for herself and for Marcus. But beneath her calm exterior, there was an unspoken worry that no matter the outcome, things would never be the same. The moment of truth arrived when the jury began deliberating. The courtroom had been packed, not just with people from the town but with a small group of activists, friends, and supporters who had heard about the case and felt moved to come. It was no longer just about one officer's actions. It was about the community, about the systemic injustices that had taken place for generations, and about standing up for what was right. As the jury went behind closed doors, Marcus sat in the quiet room with his mother, both of them too anxious to speak. The clock seemed to tick endlessly. Every passing second felt like an eternity. But then, finally, the door opened. The bailiff stepped into the room, holding the piece of paper that would decide everything. The judge entered, his face as unreadable as ever. He motioned for everyone to take their seats, and the silence in the room grew deeper. Marcus and Evelyn sat side by side, each feeling the weight of what was about to happen. The town was on the verge of a turning point, and they would either be part of a new beginning or a painful, unresolved ending. The jury foreperson stood and read aloud the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer John Davis, guilty of misconduct in office and excessive use of force against Evelyn Jenkins. The words hit Marcus like a wave, sweeping over him with both relief and exhaustion. His mother's hand tightened in his, and he could feel her shoulders shaking as she silently held back tears. The crowd erupted into applause and cheers. For the first time in what felt like forever, justice had been served. But there was still more to come. The fight wasn't over. The verdict had come down on one charge, but the case had deeper layers that needed to be addressed. The larger question remained: how would the town move forward? Could the wounds caused by this incident heal? The weeks that followed the trial were a whirlwind. Officer Davis was officially fired from the force, and an internal investigation was launched to determine the extent of his previous actions. Though this was a victory for the Jenkins family, Marcus and Evelyn knew that it was only a small piece of the puzzle. The community still had work to do to address the biases and injustices that had been allowed to fester for so long. Marcus found himself thrust into the spotlight. The media that had covered the trial now turned its focus on him and his family, interviewing them about their victory. But it wasn't easy for Marcus to accept the attention. He wasn't fighting for fame or recognition. He was fighting for the dignity of his mother, and for the countless others who had been mistreated by the same systems of power. The media coverage helped bring attention to the issue of police brutality, but it also drew criticism from those who didn't want to face the truth. Some people in the town were uncomfortable with the attention the case had brought, and there were still whispers of disbelief, as if the outcome had been a fluke. But as the months passed, Marcus began to feel the change. More and more people in the community spoke out about the importance of fairness, of standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. Some of those who had initially been silent began to open up, sharing their own stories of mistreatment and prejudice. The town, once divided, started to come together. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't an immediate transformation, but there was hope now. The fear that had once kept people quiet was slowly being replaced with courage. For Evelyn, the healing process was slower. Though the physical marks on her body had faded, the emotional scars would take time to heal. She had always been strong, but the events of that day had shaken her deeply. The racism she had experienced was nothing new to her. It had been there all her life, hiding just beneath the surface. But to experience it so violently, so publicly, had been something else entirely. She wasn't sure if she could ever fully forget what had happened, but she knew she couldn't live in anger forever. One day, months after the trial, Evelyn sat in the living room, looking out the window at the neighborhood she had called home for so many years. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the street. It was peaceful, and for a moment, she felt a sense of calm that she hadn't felt in a long time. Marcus came into the room, sitting down beside her. "We did it, didn't we?" he said softly, his voice filled with gratitude and a bit of wonder. Evelyn smiled, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "We did, Marcus. But the work's not finished. We've only just begun." Marcus nodded, looking out the window with her. He knew she was right. This was just one step. There was still much more to do. But he also knew that they had made a difference. They had stood up for what was right, even when the odds were against them. And that, he realized, was the most important thing of all. The community had changed, and though the scars of the past might never fully disappear, there was hope now, a hope that things could be different. There would be challenges ahead, but Marcus and Evelyn had proven that one voice, one act of courage, could spark something powerful. And in that moment, both of them knew that the future, though uncertain, held promise. For the Jenkins family, it was no longer just about the incident involving Officer Davis. It had become a battle for justice, for dignity, and for a sense of right and wrong that the town had long been missing. Marcus, though still angry and hurt by the events that had unfolded, knew that this was his chance to make sure his mother's voice was heard. It wasn't just for her, it was for everyone who had been treated unfairly, everyone who had been silenced by the system. As the day of the trial loomed closer, the entire town seemed to be divided. On one side were those who supported Marcus and his mother, those who believed the officer had crossed the line and needed to be held accountable. On the other side were those who either defended Officer Davis or were too afraid to take a stand. It was clear that the incident had shaken something deep within the community. People were forced to confront the uncomfortable truths that had been buried for far too long. Marcus spent countless hours with his lawyer, preparing for the trial. They had gathered evidence, testimonies, and all the facts they could find. The witnesses were ready to speak, each one describing the events they had seen that day. Some had witnessed the entire incident, others had seen the aftermath, but they all agreed on one thing: Officer Davis had acted with unnecessary violence. His behavior was unprovoked, and his treatment of Evelyn had been cruel and unjust. The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney who had handled similar cases in the past, was confident that they had a strong case. He knew the officer's history of misconduct, and he knew that if they could bring it to light, there was a good chance that Officer Davis would be held accountable for his actions. But there was also the harsh reality of what this trial would mean for the Jenkins family. The media coverage had been overwhelming, and Marcus knew that his every move would be scrutinized. The day of the trial arrived, and the courthouse was crowded with people. Reporters lined the hallways, their cameras flashing as they captured every moment. Outside, a small group of protesters had gathered, holding signs demanding justice for Evelyn Jenkins. The scene was tense, but there was also a sense of hope in the air. This was the moment when the truth would come out, when the lies and the cover-ups would be exposed. As Marcus and Evelyn entered the courthouse, they were met with a mix of stares and whispers. The eyes of the town were on them. For many, this was not just a case about an officer's wrongdoing. It was about the system itself, about whether the truth would be allowed to rise above the lies. It was about whether people like Marcus and Evelyn, people who had lived their lives with dignity, would finally be heard. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The judge, an older man with a reputation for fairness, called the court to order. Officer Davis, in his full uniform, sat at the defense table, his eyes locked on the ground. He hadn't made eye contact with Marcus or Evelyn since the incident. His lawyer, a confident, well-spoken woman, sat beside him, ready to defend his actions. The defense was going to argue that Davis had been following protocol, that his actions had been justified under the circumstances. But Marcus and his lawyer knew that this argument was weak. The evidence was clear, and they were determined to prove that Officer Davis had acted recklessly, without cause, and without empathy. The trial began with the prosecutor calling Evelyn to the stand. As she made her way to the witness chair, the room fell silent. She was still recovering from the trauma of what had happened, but her strength and resolve shone through. She sat down, her hands steady, her eyes clear. She glanced at Marcus, offering him a small, reassuring smile. "Mrs. Jenkins," the prosecutor began, his voice gentle, "can you please tell the court what happened on the day of the incident?" Evelyn took a deep breath, her mind flashing back to that awful moment. She spoke slowly, recounting the events with as much detail as she could remember. She described how Officer Davis had approached her, how he had accused her of suspicious behavior for no reason, and how he had violently tied her up and dragged her across the gravel. Her voice wavered only once, when she mentioned the pain she had felt, both physically and emotionally. "I didn't understand why he was doing this to me," Evelyn said quietly. "I've lived in this town for years. I've never caused trouble. I just wanted to go home." Her testimony was powerful. It was clear that the officer's actions had been unprovoked and unnecessary. The room listened intently as she spoke, and it was evident that her words were resonating with many of the people present. There were murmurs in the room, some of disbelief, others of empathy. Next, the prosecutor called the witnesses to the stand. One by one, they described what they had seen. Some had witnessed the officer tying Evelyn up, others had seen her being dragged across the street. Each witness painted a picture of an officer who had acted without restraint, without regard for the person he was hurting. It was during the testimony of one of the neighbors, a woman named Clara, that the tide began to turn. Clara had seen the entire incident unfold from her front porch. She had watched as Officer Davis had approached Evelyn, as he had tied her hands with a rope, and as he had dragged her down the street. She was visibly shaken as she described the scene, her voice trembling with anger. "I've never seen anything like it," Clara said, her eyes tearing up. "He didn't have to do that. She was just an old woman. I thought for sure he was going to hurt her even more." Clara's testimony was crucial. It added weight to the growing evidence that Officer Davis had acted out of anger, not out of a desire to protect the community. The defense tried to discredit Clara, suggesting that she was exaggerating, but the jury was already starting to see the truth. The officer had overstepped, and it was becoming clear that he would have to answer for his actions. The defense attorney, a sharp and calculated woman, tried to paint Evelyn and Marcus as troublemakers. She suggested that Marcus had provoked Officer Davis, that his actions had been an overreaction to a simple arrest. But the prosecutor was quick to counter, pointing out the officer's history of similar behavior, his tendency to target people of color, and the lack of any real evidence that Evelyn had done anything wrong. As the trial continued, the pressure mounted. The town was watching, and Marcus knew that what happened here would have far-reaching consequences. It wasn't just about his mother anymore, it was about standing up for what was right, about demanding accountability for actions that had been ignored for far too long. The closing arguments came, and Marcus felt his nerves starting to settle. The evidence was clear. The witnesses had spoken the truth. And now it was time for the jury to decide. Evelyn sat beside her son, her hand in his, both of them waiting for what would come next. The fate of Officer Davis and the future of their community was now in the hands of the jury. "Mom, we have to do something. This can't just slide," Marcus said, his voice trembling with emotion as he started the car and pulled away from the scene. Evelyn, looking at her son with a mixture of concern and compassion, shook her head slowly. "Marcus, you can't take on the whole world by yourself. We'll figure it out. The police will have to answer for this, but we have to go about it the right way." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He knew his mother was right, but it was hard to accept. Every part of him wanted to confront the officer again, to make sure Davis understood the weight of what he had done. But deep down, Marcus knew that violence wasn't the answer. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. The town, the very place he had grown up, had turned its back on his mother. He knew he needed to keep his emotions in check, but that was easier said than done. As they drove toward their home, the streets seemed to blur by. Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. He wasn't just worried about the immediate injustice that had been done to his mother, but he was also thinking about the broader implications. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a pattern, a history of systemic abuse that had been happening for years, even decades. The town had always had its racial divide, but he had never expected this, never imagined that his own mother, a woman who had done nothing but contribute to the community, would be treated this way. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Marcus turned off the engine and sat still for a moment. He glanced over at his mother. Evelyn had always been the strong one, the one who held the family together. Seeing her like this, injured and shaken, made him realize just how much he had taken her strength for granted. "I don't know what to do, Mom," Marcus finally confessed, his voice quiet. "I can't just let this go. But I'm scared, too." "What happens next?" Evelyn's eyes softened. She reached over and placed her hand gently on his arm. "I know, Marcus. I know it's hard. But we have to be smart about this. You can't fight fire with fire. You need to gather the evidence, make sure the truth is heard." Marcus nodded, taking a deep breath. He had already decided he would not back down. His mother had been wronged, and he would do everything in his power to make sure justice was served. The next few days were a blur. The media had caught wind of the incident, and the town was split. Some were sympathetic, outraged by the officer's actions, while others were quick to defend Davis, claiming that he was just doing his job. It seemed like the entire town was divided, and Marcus found himself at the center of it. The phone calls began pouring in, some from people who offered their support, others from those who doubted him and questioned his actions. The local news covered the story extensively, with footage of the aftermath, showing Evelyn's bruised face and her testimony about what had happened. It was a hard watch, but Marcus knew it was necessary. If people were going to understand the truth, they had to see it for themselves. The police department, meanwhile, tried to downplay the incident. They released a statement, claiming that Officer Davis had been following protocol and that his actions, while harsh, were justified given the circumstances. The statement didn't sit well with Marcus. It was as if they were trying to make his mother the problem, to shift the blame away from the officer who had dragged her across the gravel. But Marcus wasn't going to let them get away with it. He hired a lawyer, someone who was familiar with civil rights cases, and together, they began to build a case. They gathered witnesses from the scene, some of whom had seen the entire altercation unfold. Several of Evelyn's neighbors came forward, sharing their accounts of how Davis had treated Evelyn, how he had dragged her, how he had tied her up for no reason other than the color of her skin. As the days passed, Marcus felt a mixture of emotions. The anger still burned inside him, but now it was fueled by a sense of purpose. He wasn't going to back down. He was going to fight for his mother, for all the people who had been mistreated like this, for the countless others who had suffered in silence. He would take this all the way, no matter the cost. Evelyn, though recovering physically, remained shaken by the whole ordeal. The bruises on her wrists faded, but the emotional scars lingered. She tried to keep a brave face, for Marcus' sake, but inside, she was still processing what had happened. The pain was not just physical, it was deeper. It was the pain of being treated as less than human, of being dehumanized by someone who was supposed to protect and serve. One evening, after a long day of meetings and interviews with the lawyer, Marcus sat with his mother in their living room. The soft glow of the lamp cast a warm light over them. It was a quiet moment, a brief respite from the chaos of the past few days. "Mom," Marcus said softly, "I won't stop. I won't let them get away with this. You didn't deserve any of this." Evelyn looked at him, her eyes filled with pride, despite the pain. "I know, Marcus. I know you won't. And I'm proud of you. We'll get through this together." Marcus nodded, determination etched on his face. The road ahead was long, and it was going to be difficult. But he was ready. He was ready to fight for his mother, for justice, and for a future where no one had to endure what they had gone through. "To stop right there," he ordered, his tone harsh and condescending. "I've had complaints about people suspiciously walking around this neighborhood." Evelyn raised an eyebrow in confusion. "Suspicious? I'm just walking home from. Marcus Jenkins was at work when his phone buzzed. The sound was familiar, but today it carried an unfamiliar weight. His mother, Evelyn Jenkins, had been in a confrontation with the police. He stood up from his desk, his mind already racing with questions. What had happened? Was she all right? His heart pounded as he quickly dialed her number. The phone rang several times before the voicemail picked up. He left a hurried message, hoping for a call back. But nothing came. He felt the weight of the silence press down on him, and his concern deepened. "Mom? Are you okay? Please call me back," Marcus whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. But the only thing that echoed in his mind was the image of his mother, vulnerable and alone, and the terror he now felt. He couldn't sit still. His thoughts began to spiral. What kind of situation could his mother have gotten into with the police? Evelyn had always been so calm, so composed, and yet now, she was in trouble. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Minutes later, the phone rang again. It wasn't his mother, but a local neighbor, Mrs. Roberts, calling to share the horrifying news. Her voice was shaky, and it was clear she had just witnessed something terrible. "Marcus," Mrs. Roberts began, her words rushed. "You need to get here, now. It's your mom, she's been hurt." His breath caught in his throat. What happened? Is she okay? There was an officer. Officer Davis. He hurt her, Marcus. He dragged her across the street, tied her up, and... I'm so sorry. She needs you. The phone cut out for a moment, and then Mrs. Roberts continued. You need to come now. Marcus didn't hesitate. He grabbed his keys, his legs moving on their own as he rushed out of the building. His mind was filled with anger and confusion. How could someone do that to his mother? To Evelyn, a woman who had spent her life helping others, supporting the community, and raising him with love and care? The thought of someone hurting her, especially a police officer, made his stomach turn. The drive to the scene felt like an eternity. Each stoplight, each turn, each moment felt like it dragged on for hours. He could hardly focus on the road as images of his mother filled his mind. What was she going through? Was she in pain? What had the officer done to her? As he neared the corner of Maple Street, Marcus saw a gathering of people at the intersection. He could feel his heart rate quicken as he approached, his eyes searching through the crowd. There, in the center of it all, he saw her, his mother. She was standing, but barely. Her body was bruised, her clothes torn, and her wrists were bound with rough rope. The sight was almost too much to bear. Without thinking, Marcus slammed the brakes and jumped out of the car. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the concerned faces around him. His only focus was on his mother. "Mom," he called out, his voice trembling with fear. Evelyn's eyes flickered up at the sound of his voice. She was weak, her face pale, but she managed a small, pained smile. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I'm fine. Don't worry about me." But Marcus wasn't fooled. His eyes quickly scanned her injuries. Her wrists were raw from the tight ropes, and she was covered in dirt and bruises from where she'd been dragged. His blood boiled with fury. He turned toward Officer Davis, who stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, looking completely unbothered by the chaos he'd caused. The officer's smug expression only fueled Marcus' rage. "What did you do to her?" Marcus demanded, his voice low but seething with anger. Officer Davis looked him up and down, as if Marcus were the one at fault. "She was causing a disturbance. I had to restrain her," he said, his tone dismissive. "Causing a disturbance?" Marcus repeated incredulously. "She's an old woman. What the hell is wrong with you?" Before Davis could respond, Marcus took a step forward. He could feel the heat of the situation rising, but he couldn't back down. He needed to protect his mother. "Untie her now," he ordered, his voice full of authority. The crowd watched in silence, some glancing nervously at the officer, others at Marcus. They all knew the risk confronting a police officer in this way was dangerous. But Marcus was beyond caring. His mother had been hurt, and nothing else mattered in that moment. Officer Davis didn't take kindly to the challenge. His eyes narrowed, and without a word, he reached for his cuffs, ready to arrest Marcus. "You need to step back, sir," he said coldly, his hand twitching near his belt. Marcus was already too far gone. The sight of his mother in pain, the sight of this officer treating her like an animal, pushed him past the breaking point. Without thinking, he stepped toward the officer, pushing him away. "You're not taking her anywhere," Marcus shouted, his voice a mix of desperation and fury. Officer Davis staggered back, momentarily caught off guard. But then, his eyes flashed with anger. He lunged at Marcus, attempting to grab him. In that instant, Marcus shoved him harder, knocking the officer off balance. The force of the push was enough to send Officer Davis tumbling to the ground. The crowd gasped, but Marcus was already kneeling beside his mother, untangling the ropes from her wrists as fast as he could. He could hear Davis scrambling to his feet behind him, but his focus was solely on his mother. Evelyn was trembling, but she whispered, "Marcus, it's okay. Let's just go home." But Marcus wasn't hearing it. He was too consumed by anger. The officer had hurt her, humiliated her, and now he was going to pay. "Stay down," Marcus yelled as Officer Davis stood up, anger flashing in his eyes. But it was too late. Marcus' emotions had taken control. He was ready to defend his mother, no matter the cost. Just then, the sound of sirens broke through the tension in the air. More police cars were arriving on the scene. The situation had escalated quickly. Marcus was ready to fight if it came to that, but a moment of clarity swept over him. He had to get his mother out of here. They couldn't stay. The officers surrounding the area moved in, but they didn't dare make another move. Davis' smugness had evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard stare. It was clear to everyone present that the situation had gotten out of hand. "Get her to safety," Marcus told the nearest officer, his voice firm but shaky. As they made their way to the car, Marcus felt his heart still racing. But there was no turning back now. His mother had been hurt, and the fight for justice was just beginning. The market. Without another word, Officer Davis stepped forward, his hand reaching out to grab her arm. "I said, stop right there. You're under suspicion." "Move it," he snapped, ignoring her confusion. Evelyn's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm just an old woman, officer. I've lived in this town for over 40 years, and I don't cause trouble." But the officer wasn't listening. He yanked her arm, pulling her toward the curb as if she were a criminal. Evelyn stumbled, trying to keep her balance, but the officer's grip was strong. "You'll keep walking, and I'll make sure you don't cause any more trouble around here," he muttered under his breath. Evelyn was now frightened. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet here she was being treated like a criminal. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm just trying to get home." "What's this about?" But Officer Davis didn't want to hear it. His grip tightened on her wrist, and before Evelyn could react, he pulled out a thick, rough rope from his belt. "You're not going anywhere," he said with a grin. He tied one end of the rope around her wrists, so tightly it cut into her skin, and then dragged her across the gravel of the sidewalk. The pain was unbearable. Evelyn cried out, but the officer paid no mind. He was determined to show her who was in control. The sharp stones dug into her skin as she was dragged, her feet scraping against the ground. She was unable to free herself, and her groceries scattered on the ground, the contents of her bags spilling out in every direction. Her hands were bound tightly, the ropes cutting into her delicate skin as she tried to pull free. "Please. Let go of me. What are you doing?" Evelyn cried, her voice hoarse with panic. But Officer Davis remained cold and unbothered, his face showing no remorse. "You should have known better than to walk around here," he muttered, ignoring her cries. As Evelyn was dragged further down the road, a few neighbors began to peek out from behind their windows. Some shook their heads, others exchanged glances, but no one dared to intervene. It was as if everyone was too scared to act, too worried about the consequences. Evelyn was alone in this moment, helpless, humiliated, and afraid. Officer Davis continued to drag her, a smug look on his face as he marched her down the street like a prisoner. The gravel scraped against her skin, leaving a trail of red marks where the rough surface made contact. She felt her strength fading with every pull. Her body was old, fragile, and not built to endure such treatment, but she refused to give in. She wouldn't let this officer break her spirit. The sounds of her cries filled the air, but they seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officer didn't care about her age, her history, or her dignity. To him, she was just another person to assert his power over. Every few steps, he would tug the rope, pulling her harshly and making sure that no one could misunderstand who was in charge. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached a quiet corner of the street. Officer Davis paused, his hand still clutching the rope. He looked around, ensuring that no one was paying attention to the scene. With a sudden, sharp motion, he threw Evelyn to the ground. The fall sent a jolt of pain through her body. Her hands, still tightly bound, were crushed beneath her as she lay there, helpless. Evelyn's mind raced. Was this how it would end for her? Was this how her life, filled with so many years of service and kindness to her community, would be remembered? Dragged on the ground like an animal by a racist cop who saw her as nothing more than a target for his cruelty? But something inside her refused to let the situation define her. Despite the pain, despite the humiliation, Evelyn knew she wasn't alone. She had her family, her community, and her dignity. She could not let this moment, this officer's injustice, break her. As she lay there on the gravel, bruised and battered, Evelyn silently vowed that she would never let this injustice go unnoticed. This officer may have tried to humiliate her, to break her, but she would find a way to fight back. She had lived through so much in her lifetime, and this would not be the end of her story.